What happens if America's protective shield slips away from Europe's front lines? This question, once the stuff of grim think tank simulations and speculative fiction, is now at the heart of a rapidly changing reality. Imagine a Europe where the United States, after serving for almost 80 years as the ultimate guarantor of Western security, begins to steadily withdraw its forces from NATO's eastern edge. This is not a sudden retreat, but a carefully telegraphed strategic pivot, one with few precedents since the earliest days of the Cold War. For decades, American troops have been the backbone of Europe's sense of safety, a living symbol of transatlantic unity. Bases in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Slovakia have not only hosted thousands of soldiers, but also represented an unwavering promise that Europe's easternmost members would never stand alone. Now, that promise is being rewritten. As American boots vanish from outposts near the Black Sea and across the Carpathian Basin, the continent is abruptly thrust into a new age, one defined by uncertainty, accountability, and the need for a collective European awakening. The vacuum left by this recalibration does not remain empty for long. Germany, the economic engine and political heavyweight of the European Union, steps forward in a way unseen since the Cold War's end. In a stunning announcement, Berlin pledges to send the single largest shipment of attack drones in its history, up to 12,000 kamikaze drones, to Lithuania. This is far more than a routine defense contract. It is a watershed moment. These drones will not only fortify NATO's most exposed border with Russia, but also send a pointed signal to Moscow and Minsk. Germany is willing to assume the mantle of European security leadership. This decision is not made in a vacuum. It recalls another era when the continent faced existential threats from the East. In the late 1940s, after the Second World War, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding shattered European economies and forging the North Atlantic Treaty Organization itself as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Now, as American focus shifts elsewhere, Europe must ask, who will play the role of anchor this time? Germany, with its historical baggage and newfound resolve, appears ready to try. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine rages on. Artillery thunders across Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Yet, in a carefully choreographed television address, Vladimir Putin delivers an unexpected proposal: a temporary ceasefire. The world holds its breath. Is this a genuine olive branch, a bid for peace, or merely a tactical pause before launching a more devastating offensive? The historical parallels are unsettling. During World War I, both Allied and Central powers periodically called for armistices, only to use the breathing room to regroup and intensify the conflict. Doubt swirls in Kyiv and across Europe. No one is sure whether to trust the offer or prepare for an even fiercer storm. Across the globe, a diplomatic spectacle unfolds. For the first time in more than 6 years, Donald Trump, once again a central figure in American politics, sits down with Xi Jinping, the formidable leader of China. Their handshake, broadcast live and analyzed in real time by every major news outlet, could redraw the map of American-Chinese relations. The stakes are immense. Any shift in Washington-Beijing dynamics could tip the scales in the Ukraine war, influence energy markets, and alter the global balance of power. For ordinary Europeans, these events are not distant headlines. They are tremors shaking the ground beneath daily life. In Warsaw, families wonder how rising defense spending will impact healthcare and schools. In Vienna, commuters brace for energy bills that have doubled in just 2 years. At the Hungarian-Slovak border, new checkpoints and passport controls snarl traffic, reviving memories of a pre-Schengen Europe. Across the continent, jobs, personal safety, and even the meaning of citizenship are suddenly up for debate. Europe risks being caught flat-footed, as unity, credibility, and the resilience of democracy are tested like never before. Are European nations prepared for a future where American protection is no longer guaranteed? Or is the continent on the brink of a crisis that could reach into every home, upending the peace and prosperity built over generations? Let us unravel how these critical moves will shape Europe's security, unity, and its place in the world. First, we examine the immediate fallout from the American drawdown and how European leaders are scrambling to fill the gap. What does this mean for NATO's eastern members, those on the very front line of potential aggression? To answer this, consider the experience of Romania. For years, the Mihail Kogalnicianu Air Base near Constanta has been a key hub for American and NATO operations, its runways buzzing with F-16 fighters and C-130 transport planes. Now, with the United States pulling back more than 1,200 troops, the country faces the prospect of defending its Black Sea coast with far fewer resources. The shock is felt not just in numbers, but in psychology. In Bulgaria, the drawdown triggers a swift parliamentary debate. Lawmakers recall the events of 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and sent shockwaves through the region. The American presence, once taken for granted, is now seen as a lifeline slipping away. In Hungary and Slovakia, government ministers scramble to reassure the public, promising new investments in homegrown defense industries and seeking closer ties with neighbors. But behind these maneuvers lies a stark calculation. The United States is not abandoning Europe entirely, but it is pivoting its military focus eastward, far past Europe, to the Indo-Pacific. What was once a theoretical contest with China has become the driving force behind a global realignment. Washington's resources, attention, and resolve are shifting. The so-called pivot to Asia, debated in policy circles since the early 2000s, has become a hard fact, with ripple effects reaching deep into NATO's eastern flank. Still, the withdrawal is not total, and the exceptions are telling. Poland, for example, stands out as a crucial outpost, at least for now. In recent summits, American and Polish leaders reaffirmed that U.S. deployments there will remain, perhaps even expand. This positions Warsaw as a new military hub and quite possibly the linchpin of American strategy in Europe. Yet, this special status only intensifies old rivalries, particularly with Berlin and Paris. The result? New fractures within the alliance, just as unity is needed most. For Europe's eastern members, the stakes have rarely been higher. Their security now depends not just on outside guarantees, but on their ability to adapt, fast. The threats are twin: emboldened adversaries from the east, particularly Russia, and rising suspicion and competition among supposed allies. The old certainties are gone. The future is up for grabs. With American forces departing, European leaders face a stark question. Can they close the gap, and will their people accept the risks and sacrifices that come next? The precedent of the 1930s, when Western democracies failed to respond decisively to gathering threats, haunts every policy meeting. European unity, so often taken for granted, is suddenly in question. As the dust settles, cracks begin to appear in the alliance's foundation. Behind closed doors, leaders scramble to redefine strategy, while adversaries watch for any sign of weakness. For example, in a leaked NATO briefing, senior officials warned that the rapid drawdown could create a window of opportunity for Russian hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation, and sabotage, just as happened in Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014. Can Europe truly stand alone as threats gather at its borders? Or will hesitation and division turn vulnerability into catastrophe? With American soldiers pulling back from eastern outposts, European capitals are jolted into action. In Berlin, the Bundestag convenes an emergency session. Lawmakers debate a 10-year, €100 billion defense investment plan, dwarfing anything seen since reunification. The goal: to triple the production of armored vehicles, accelerate the rollout of air defense systems, and, crucially, replenish depleted ammunition stocks. In Paris, President Macron revives the call for a European Security Council, a body capable of making rapid, binding military decisions without waiting for full NATO consensus. Germany's step to send up to 12,000 kamikaze drones to Lithuania is a bold one. The contract, valued at nearly €1 billion, is split across 3 companies: Rheinmetall, a storied name in German industry, and 2 fast-moving startups, one specializing in artificial intelligence targeting, the other in resilient supply chains. By dividing the order, Germany aims to foster competition, accelerate innovation, and avoid the risk of a single supplier bottleneck. The message is clear. Europe cannot afford to be slow or complacent. Yet beneath this show of resolve, anxiety simmers. France, once again, is championing the cause of European strategic autonomy. French leaders argue that the continent must learn to defend itself, without perpetual American support. But the hurdles are formidable. Europe's patchwork of armies, rival doctrines, and mismatched equipment often leads to confusion rather than strength. For instance, the French and German armies still use incompatible radios and ammunition calibers, a legacy of decades-old procurement policies. The dream of a unified European defense remains just that, a dream, tangled in national rivalries and political hesitation. Warnings are growing sharper. Belgium's defense minister, in a widely circulated speech, accuses Europe of underestimating Moscow's ambitions. He notes that even now, NATO lacks a fully deployable rapid reaction force. If crisis strikes, Europe could be caught flat-footed, exposed by indecision. His warning is blunt. Hesitation and division could turn vulnerability into catastrophe, just as was nearly the case during the Suez Crisis of 1956, when conflicting national interests paralyzed Western response. The debate is fierce and unresolved. Some claim that renewed investment and focus could build a real deterrent against Russian aggression. They point to the example of Finland and Sweden, both of which have dramatically increased defense spending and reintroduced conscription, transforming their societies into models of resilience. Others argue that, without the American military umbrella, Europe is dangerously exposed, far more than its leaders admit. The experience of 1940, when France fell in weeks despite having one of the world's largest armies, is never far from anyone's mind. What hangs in the balance is not just military security, but the very core of Europe's political stability and unity. If defense integration fails, the continent could become an easy target for adversaries abroad, and a battleground for internal discord. The stakes reach far beyond geopolitics, touching the everyday safety and stability of millions. Consider the Baltic states, where civil defense drills and public education campaigns have become routine, and where local governments stockpile food and fuel in case of a sudden blockade or cyber attack. As Europe rushes to reinforce its defenses, diplomatic tensions and a wave of local crises threaten to upset the fragile equilibrium. In Italy, for example, a sudden influx of refugees from Ukraine and North Africa overwhelms local services, sparking protests and straining the coalition government. In Spain, farmers block highways to protest new EU sanctions on Russian grain, illustrating how economic and strategic shocks ripple through every layer of society. But the next move will not be made in a conference room or on a battlefield. Instead, it will come from a single city caught between rival powers, Kyiv, where every decision has immediate and far-reaching consequences for millions of lives. As threats gather at Europe's borders, internal strains are intensifying. Can unity survive the storm? The world's gaze turns to South Korea, where former President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping share their first face-to-face meeting in more than 6 years. The stakes could hardly be higher. In a scene reminiscent of Richard Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972, their private discussions may redraw the lines between the United States and China, echoing outward to shape the fate of Kyiv and the future of global order. Every continent watches, nerves taut. Diplomats speculate, will a handshake signal de-escalation or spark a new era of confrontation? The answers, forged behind closed doors, could tip the balance in the Ukraine conflict and beyond, just as the Yalta Conference of 1945 set the tone for decades of Cold War rivalry. Meanwhile, Turkey emerges as the alliance's wildcard. As a pivotal NATO member, Ankara juggles its Western commitments while maintaining a pragmatic rapport with Moscow. With new negotiations over arms deals and security guarantees unfolding, Turkey's next steps could serve as either bridge or chasm, its unpredictability now a central variable in Europe's security equation. Turkish drones, which once shifted the balance in Nagorno-Karabakh, now become bargaining chips in a wider contest. The lessons of the Crimean War, when the Ottoman Empire played off great powers against each other, are not lost on today's strategists. Inside Ukraine, desperation deepens. Frontline battles intensify, and the civilian toll mounts with each passing day. In a move that shocks many, President Vladimir Putin offers a temporary ceasefire and invites Western journalists to witness the war up close. Yet suspicion reigns in Kyiv and European capitals. Is this a genuine peace overture, or a calculated ploy to fracture Western resolve and sway global opinion? The precedent of the Minsk agreements, repeatedly violated by Russia, fuels skepticism. The reverberations of war pulse through European society. In Germany and Poland, surges of Ukrainian refugees, including a growing number of young men, fan heated debate. Economic uncertainty and housing shortages add fuel to local anxieties. Political rhetoric grows sharper as communities confront the pace and scale of change. Mayors in cities such as Berlin and Krakow plead for more federal assistance, warning of strains on schools, hospitals, and police. Across the continent, far-right parties seize the moment. Playing on fears about migration and military support for Ukraine, they stoke division and distrust. Their strategy is clear: exploit grievances to weaken faith in democracy and undermine the ideal of a united Europe. In France, the national rally calls for a referendum on military aid, while in Italy, the League demands tighter border controls. Should these fractures widen, the consequences could be dire, for Ukraine, for European stability, and for the very fabric of the European Union. The crisis now cuts deeper than politics. Europe's social cohesion strains under the weight of economic fears, cultural shifts, and doubts about security. The challenge is not only to withstand aggression from outside, but to resist the centrifugal forces threatening solidarity within. The memory of Yugoslavia's violent breakup in the 1990s is an ever-present warning. As cracks widen, European leaders face a stark choice: adapt swiftly or risk losing control of their continent's destiny. The fate of the European project may hinge not on a single battle, but on the ability to hold society together against mounting pressures. Is Europe's most dangerous vulnerability not a foreign adversary, but something festering from within, found in social unrest and a shrinking populace? Ignore, for a moment, the headlines about tanks, treaties, and shifting alliances. Peer beneath the surface, and a deeper, more corrosive crisis is revealed. Across Europe, heated disputes over identity, loyalty, and belonging have fractured public debate. The uproar surrounding laws on so-called foreign agents and efforts to criminalize pensioners for supposed anti-state speech are more than mere policy feuds. They are open wounds, exposing a rift that slices through the continent's democratic core. Election season in nations such as Germany and Poland does not heal these divisions. It sharpens them. Politicians court voters by demanding new restrictions on social assistance for Ukrainian men of conscription age. These slogans do not stay confined to campaign rallies. They leach into daily life, sowing suspicion between neighbors, and eroding the fragile trust among citizens, migrants, and refugees. In some German towns, local councils propose fingerprinting Ukrainian men before dispersing aid, triggering outrage and protest. What begins as political maneuvering soon infects culture itself. In Russia, calls to ban cherished cartoons like Masha and the Bear highlight how cultural icons become pawns in a wider conflict. When the stories meant to unite children are weaponized, it is not just nostalgia that is lost. It is social stability under assault. Such battles over the familiar signal how vulnerable public sentiment is to manipulation in anxious times. The experience of the 1930s, when anti-Semitic propaganda turned neighbors against each other, is a chilling historical parallel. Yet the gravest threat is not always the loudest. Beneath the noise lies a quiet, relentless crisis: demographic decline. Nobel laureate Claudia Goldin's findings illuminate a stark paradox. As women gain autonomy, birth rates fall, not solely by choice, but because economic and social barriers make parenthood daunting. Sky-high housing costs, rigid job structures, and scant childcare support trap young families in a holding pattern, turning the so-called population winter from a distant worry into an urgent, multiplying dilemma. In Italy, the average age of first-time mothers has risen above 30, and the country's population is shrinking for the first time since World War II. If governments fail to act boldly, to remove these barriers and truly invest in families, the slow unraveling of Europe's population could do what no invading army has managed: sap the continent's resilience. A dwindling workforce, ballooning elderly population, and fraying bonds between generations threaten not only economic dynamism, but also the very survival of the welfare state. Japan's experience, where decades of stagnation followed a demographic cliff, offers a sobering warning. This is the churn at the heart of Europe's predicament. Not only border clashes or diplomatic realignments, but profound, slow-burning changes from within. Left unchecked, polarization and demographic decline could hollow out Europe's defenses, undermining security, prosperity, and unity from the inside. The lessons of the late Roman Empire, where internal decay proved as deadly as external invasion, resonate with renewed force. So, as these historic crises converge and intensify, what meaningful choices remain for Europe's leaders and its people? With pressure mounting from both within and without, Europe faces a critical crossroads. The next moves, by ordinary citizens and those in power, will shape not only the continent's future, but the world's balance of power. The stakes could not be higher. Europe teeters at a decisive crossroads. The continent's fate, its peace, prosperity, and unity, now hangs in the balance. The ongoing reduction of American military presence in Eastern Europe is far more than a shift in troop numbers. It is a seismic warning that the familiar order is crumbling. For every citizen and leader, the question is urgent. Will Europe seize this moment to protect what it has built, or let hesitation and discord unravel decades of progress? The risks of passivity are enormous. If Europe falters, it could lose not just its border security, but the very foundations of its economic strength and democratic values. Inaction may leave nations exposed, communities fractured, and the continent vulnerable to both foreign aggression and internal strife. The world's shifting alliances and great power rivalries are already reshaping the global landscape. Europe cannot afford to stand still. In capitals from Paris to Warsaw, debate rages. Some leaders demand bold new defense commitments, others plead for unity and structural reforms. Yet, too many cling to outdated assumptions, hoping that past crises will not repeat themselves. But hope is not a strategy. The time for clear-eyed realism and decisive collective action has arrived. Europe's next chapter requires much more than increased military spending or surface-level diplomacy. It demands a renewed sense of common purpose, one that elevates the well-being of ordinary people above all. Robust armies and fortified borders are crucial, but so is social resilience, the capacity to weather economic shocks, withstand political polarization, and adapt to demographic shifts. The post-war years of the 1950s and 60s, when Europe rebuilt itself through unity and shared sacrifice, offer a model for what is possible. True autonomy brings heavier burdens. European nations must coordinate policies, deepen mutual trust, and invest not just in weaponry, but in cutting-edge technology, resilient industries, and the skills of their citizens. Only genuine unity, bridging divides across borders, parties, and generations, can grant Europe real control over its destiny amid rising uncertainty. Practical measures might include joint procurement of defense equipment, a unified cyber defense command, and cross-border educational programs to foster shared identity. This is no time for fear or nostalgia. It is a time to define what Europe stands for and what it is willing to defend. The choices made today will echo for generations, shaping the security, prosperity, and freedom of millions. Now is the hour for courage, vision, and collective resolve. The shield may be slipping, but the story is not over. Europe's next chapter, written by its leaders, its citizens, and its collective will, remains wide open. The question is not whether the continent can survive without America's protection, but whether it can find the unity and strength to thrive on its own terms. The answer, as always, will be forged not just in parliaments and summits, but in the daily choices of millions. The future is unwritten, yet within reach.